You know what? I've always loved the name of the company that made this game. Crack.com. The very first time I saw that, I thought it was a joke or something. Now, being older and knowing that it was the real company name, it's so bad and so cheesy that it's just awesome. And yes, their website really was called Crack.com. Did you expect anything less? Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Abuse, a game that was unique for its time, being a side-scrolling platformer where you aim and shoot with the mouse. It was hugely popular and sold many copies, but it didn't really stay in the limelight very long, and not that many people talk about it anymore. Why is that? Well, this game's sort of a paradox, because memories of playing it are always favorable, but then you sit down and actually play it, and after about a half hour you're fed up with the game. Yet you still think back to it as a fun little thing. There's a very simple reason why it works this way, but first, let's get to the game stats. Abuse was created by Crack.com, and while they had self-published the game in 1995, a later version was published by Origin Systems in 1996 with multiplayer support. And that's the version most people are going to have, including myself. It's a 1 to 8 player run-and-gun platformer with support for VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, though it also supports a multitude of SVGA modes when using the game's built-in editor. That said, the SVG modes disable the lighting engine, so their usefulness is kind of limited. The game supports both the Ensoniq Soundscape and Sound Blaster series of cards, but only for sound effects. For music, you absolutely had to have a separate music card, either an MPU 401 compatible card or one of several Roland cards, not including the MT32. For a mid-90s game, this would normally be inexcusable, but to be perfectly honest, you're not missing much. There's not much music in the game in the first place, and what's there is pretty average. As for the current release state, just wow. I thought the licensing states of Electronoid and MechWarrior were bad, but this just takes the cake. Okay, let me try to demystify this game's licensing state. Now, as we're all aware, this game started life as a commercial product, though it also had a shareware version. Curiously, the shareware version has virtually all the same assets as the commercial version, it's just missing most of the levels and prevents the use of certain weapons. Okay, now, roughly 2 years after the release of the game, the source code for the full version and almost all of the assets for the shareware version are released into the public domain. However, the levels from the commercial version and all of the sound effects remain commercially licensed. A project spawned out of this called Abuse SDL, which uses a simple direct media layer to make the game work on a variety of operating systems. Abuse SDL is a freeware project that is still being worked on and includes, with permission from the original authors, all of the assets of the full version except for the levels, which have instead been replaced by fan-created levels. Confused yet? Well, let me simplify this. The only way to get the original Abuse experience and the only way to play the original levels is to buy the DOS version. It's not too hard to find, you can usually get it pretty cheap, about $5 or so. There's also an app you can buy for Apple's mobile products called Abuse Classic, which is essentially the same game with touchscreen controls. Or, if you have the ability to compile source code and don't mind missing out on the original levels, Abuse SDL is still an active and free project, and you can find it for download at http://abuse.zoe.org. But again, I have to make this clear, the original levels are not included, and unless you're using Linux, you need to compile the source code yourself. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk story. The first release of the game had a very simple throwaway story that took place in 2021, where a bunch of mutant ants were threatening Earth, and the game's protagonist, Nick Verena, is the sole hope of the planet. However, when the game was re-released by Origin Systems the following year, the story was changed completely. In the news story, which took place in 2009 supposedly, Nick was a falsely accused inmate serving time in an underground experimental prison complex, where inmates were unwillingly subjected to drugs in the name of science. One of these particular drugs was called abuse, and Nick was apparently the only inmate who had been tested who showed an immunity to it. However, things get out of hand, all the prison cells open up, the drug infects everyone, turning them into horribly mutated and violent creatures, and seeing as how Nick's the only one who can't be mutated, it's up to him to stop the drug from entering Earth's water supply and escape to the surface. Funnily enough, the title of the game was never intended to have any bearing on elements of the game itself. The title's actually a reference to the fact that in virtually any game, players will want to walk through every door and activate every switch, even if they were traps and doing so meant getting mauled by enemies. So the title alludes to the fact that players will be abusing themselves since virtually every switch in this game is a trap just waiting to be set off. Now, I haven't really talked about the gameplay itself yet because there really isn't that much to say. The game is basically a platformer, but unlike typical platformers with guns, you have maximum control over where you aim. You can aim in absolutely any direction you want simply by moving the mouse cursor. The controls are also really simple, with the arrow keys being used to move, jump, climb, toggle switches, etc., while the mouse buttons are used to shoot and activate special abilities. There's also a map you can bring up in multiplayer with the M key, but it doesn't work in a single player game. One of the aspects of this game that was handled extremely well was the weapons. There's 7 different weapons you can acquire in this game, and every single one of them has a very distinct feel, though because of that you tend to switch between them frequently, not just to save ammo but to fit the current situation. So I'm just going to breeze through them. The laser is your starting weapon and can even be used when it's out of ammo, but at only half of its normal firing rate. It's almost useless against hordes of mutants, but against a single target it works very well. Next are the incendiary grenades, which are not very powerful, but have a blast radius and can hit multiple enemies at once, so they're good against big groups of weaker enemies. Next are the heat-seeking rockets. These things are really powerful against single targets, and while they work okay against groups, it's usually better to stick with grenades due to the scarcity of ammo. Next is the napalm gun, which is the best weapon to use against large groups of enemies. Ammo for this weapon is very hard to find, but the shots take up half the screen and will burn most enemies to a crisp. But it's hard to aim and thus hard to use against single targets. Next is the energy rifle, which shoots a powerful burst of energy that instantly reaches your target. This weapon is hands down the best weapon versus single targets, small groups, or targets at long range. Unfortunately, it's almost useless against large groups. These last two I didn't find in-game, so I had to load them up in the editor. The Nova Spheres are really powerful against groups of enemies, but they can be a bit tricky to aim and they don't move very fast either. They're best used while retreating from enemies that are chasing you. Lastly, we have the Death Saber, which is only a short-ranged beam weapon but does incredible damage, so it's very useful when you get mauled by a huge group of enemies at point-blank range. And yeah, that was one of the main selling points of this game, was its built-in, fully featured level editor. The level editor is literally the same one used to build all the levels in the game, so as you can imagine, you can do a lot with it. Alas, it's not that easy to use and has quite the learning curve, but considering its versatility, that's understandable. The editor can also operate in Super VGA graphics modes, including 848 by 480 widescreen for those of you who have a widescreen monitor, but using a Super VGA mode disables the lighting engine. So generally what I recommend is that you build the basic layout and structure of a level using a Super VGA mode, and then add the lighting using the regular 320 by 200 VGA mode. One thing you really have to be careful with though is that the editor is designed to work in tandem with the game itself. This means you can swap in and out of game mode, but when you swap back to the editor, all changes that have happened in the game due to your actions remain permanent. This means if you want to test the level you're working on, save first. Always save first. If you don't, then you'll have to manually add back in any enemies you killed and relink them to their appropriate triggers among resetting platforms, switches, power-ups, destructible walls, etc, etc. Now, earlier I mentioned that despite how popular the game was, it seemed to be easily forgotten. Well, this is for two key reasons. The minor reason is that this game only runs internally at a frame rate of about 15 frames per second. Yeah, 1.5. I mean seriously, 15? Even Doom ran at 35 when it could, and according to the editor running at a Super VGA resolution, I can still hit an actual frame rate of 150 using DOSBox. But despite any level of power your system has, the game only updates 15 times a second, which is just plain stupid. This makes the game feel like it's stuttering every step of the way, not helped by poor collision detection and the fact that the jumping is delayed by 1 frame. Yeah, so if you're on the edge of a platform and try to jump diagonally, you'll very likely walk off the platform instead of jumping, despite the fact you pressed up and right at the exact same time. But that's only the minor issue. The major issue of this game is its difficulty. This game is beyond hard, and it knows it. Littered through every level or checkpoint so that if you die, you'll respawn with full health at the last checkpoint you used. But despite that, you are going to die hundreds of times just in the vain hope that the collision detection will work in your favor. Yes, some of the moments in this game really do come down to luck, even if you play them the same way each time. This wouldn't be so bad if the level design wasn't so evil. I mentioned earlier that the game was designed so that virtually every switch and passage was a death trap, and I wasn't kidding. There are lots of switches in this game that just have death trap written all over them, and it's not helped when enemies can literally spawn out of nothing, even though there are special wall cracks and cocoons to signify where enemies are going to be spawning from. Add this to the sheer number of enemies you'll fight at once and the rapid amount of damage they can do to you, it's just insane. Changing the difficulty setting only helps slightly. The settings are Wimp, Easy, Normal, and Extreme, at least according to the game. The actual internal designations are Easy, Normal, Hard, and Extreme. That's right, the difficulty levels were renamed at some point so that the hard skill level was actually being called the normal skill level. Yeah, this game is pure unadulterated evil, with a snazzy level editor and unique gameplay. Is it any wonder why no one plays this anymore? It was fun, it was unique, but it hated us with a passion. And that, my friends, is why you rarely hear about this game anymore. So yeah, that's abuse. It says, evil as the title makes it sound, but despite its legendary difficulty and poorly handled game mechanics, the unique weapons and unique style of play and fully featured level editor, it all puts this game in a league of its own. Would I recommend getting a copy and trying it for yourself? Well, yes, but only if you like a challenge and don't mind being tortured by a game that hates you. Taking a quick look at the DOSBox settings this time around, all you need to do is set the cycles count to max and the game should play as well as it can. It does also work with the auto setting, but it can take a few moments for it to find the right speed to play at, so max is preferred. Also, even though most copies of the game came on CD, it was designed to fit on several floppy disks, so once the game's installed, you don't need to have the CD on hand to play it. Anyways, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Tune in next Saturday for episode 57, where we're going to be taking a look at a game that's kind of like a cross between Arkanoid and Gradius. And if you think you know what game that is, then make sure you send your guess to adg@pixelships.com.